Hey everyone, I am Dr. Aaron Wheeler,
And I'm Dr. Matt Cook.
and this is Missio Pop, a podcast on popular missiology where two overeducated white dudes talk about all things in the culture of missions and God's hope for the world.
This first season, we're focusing on the task of contextualization, the way in which culture shapes and forms the way we share God's truth. We're so glad you're here.
Welcome back, everybody, to season 1, episode 5 of Missio Pop. Matt Cook, my friend, gentleman, and scholar, how are you today?
I am doing great. Don't know if I'm a gentleman, being from the hills of West Virginia. I'm a little rough around the edges. I don't know. You ever thought of about that before? Like, I work with some very distinguished, Southern gentlemen, academics. And sometimes I just don't feel like I fit in. And then I remember where I was born, and I grew up in the hills. I come from good, kind people, but boy, I did not grow up in the South where
Yeah.
everybody's
Yeah, I don't know.
dignified.
I'm a Yankee through and through. I don't know how you Southern things work. I'm still learning that and getting enculturated myself into these kind of things. I'm from south of Detroit in the rougher side of suburban Detroit life. It's not so much
Oh,
these days. It's super weird to go back to like holidays at my parents' house. I don't know if gentrified is the correct word to use, but definitely a change in demographic of the city I
yeah.
grew up in. But I never claimed to be polished.
So you come from an area where people say it like it is, right? People
Yeah,
are
we're
honest.
yeah we're real direct. So
Yeah,
in my southern Midwest life now, I get in trouble for that quite a bit.
I know.
So
I'm the
like,
same way. I come from like the people where I grew up are wonderful. They do anything for you, but they will tell you if they got a problem with you
yeah. It's just
right
simpler
away.
that way.
It is simpler that way. So it's near the end of the semester here in
It
Tennessee.
is. It is.
I have way more papers to grade than I want to think about. Are you
Well,
done? Don't tell me you're done.
no, gosh, no. My students will tell you I tend to delay on these things as well. But what I'm asking is, we need to figure out, by nature in our professions and vocations and careers, are hopefully people who can figure things out on an intellectual level. That's part of what we're paid to do. How long is it going to take us to get chat gtp to grade our papers? That's what I'm asking. If they can produce papers with ai, why can't we grade papers with ai? Like, who do we need to talk to?
Right.
My brother-in-law is a professor of computer science. I don't know if he's the guy I need to write an email to, but like, let's get on this ball rolling. we
You're
need
right.
we need ai graders. Let's be clear, for any of you who are not in this profession, grading
Hmm.
papers is the worst part of the job. There's no
You
question.
might have to explain what chat GTP, whatever, I don't even know the letters, what AI is in the academic world. Because until about a month and a half ago, I was not aware of what's going on. Talk
Oh, it
about
seemed like in my circles, it
contextualization.
was all the talk of the winter break was Chat
Okay.
GTP and how our students are already using it and the ways we need to adjust for it. I had to change an entire course assignment that happened every other week, because if I did it before, if you just use Chat GP, you could knock that thing down in 5 minutes. Um, it's a real
Some
thing.
people might chat GTP is like you can enter in a question or whatever, however it works. You can say, hey, answer these questions or
Yep.
write this paper for me, and it'll do it. So just yesterday in one of my classes, in my AX class, I have them make some videos, just some kind of fun, like case study sort of videos. And there was this British voice overlaying, they were pretending they were in London. It was funny stuff. And but there's this British accent, British voice narrating their whole video. I said, guys, that is so good. Which one of you did that? And they're like, yeah, AI did that for us. We
Yeah.
just typed in the words and it's because it spoke with inflection and
Yeah.
meaning. That's
It's a scary
incredible.
world.
It's a scary world. Can we get AI to do contextualization for us?
You know what? Maybe we could do an interview with a chat bot and we'd
That would
probably
be
learn some stuff. That's the scary thing, is
memorable.
actually would be excellent and we would all learn from it. And probably that chatbot needs to be teaching our courses. That's where we're coming from. Like, this is coming for the upper class. Like, we're all in trouble. Um, but
It's true.
no, it's a thing. I just need him to grade my papers. That's all I'm asking.
I would be
Where's the
happy with
where's the
that.
grade paper bot? Get me out of this thing. Um, I love teaching. I love students. I love this world, but I don't like grading.
Oh, I try to like it, but or I just try to survive it. I just fall asleep. I can't keep my eyes
Sure.
open.
No, a colleague of mine, he said, you need to think of this as a form of discipleship, to which I said, get out of my office. That's what we dealt with. But today, we are going to, in our season-long topic of contextualization, we're going to tackle a thorny issue, which means we're probably not going to do it well, but we're going to make an attempt. That's all this is. We keep low expectations. Of a big word, a thorny word, a word that has baggage. We'll try to walk through that right up front here. And Matt, give us the word, give us the definition, get this ball rolling.
Okay, the word is ethnocentrism.
There it is.
Listeners, you've just, if this is your first time to hear the word, congratulations, you've learned the word today. That's what I say to my undergrad students. It's usually the first time they've ever heard it. So the technical definition is this: ethnocentrism is to apply one's own culture or ethnicity as a frame of reference to judge other cultures, practices, behaviors, beliefs, and people instead of using the standards of the particular culture involved.
Yes.
You don't love that definition.
I don't love that definition because it's you know, it's a big word, and I feel like the people who come up with big words define big words and they don't realize how unhelpful they are. I feel like that's a lot of what's the problem in our world and our field. But yeah, ethnocentrism by nature, it's got the word ethno in front, ethnicity. There's a racial element to this. And you know, the centrism of it is in like, this is the center of which I look at things and I think about things and my way of doing things. And so at its heart, it's about me and my way being better than you and your way. But what I don't love about that definition is, first of all, when we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about race. There's just baggage here. It's hot topic in the worst way possible, alienating, you know, minimum 50% of your audience simply by bringing up the concept of the terminology or attaching it to it. And you know, I don't know if you know this, but people have opinions on these things. Are you aware of that?
I was aware of that.
Okay.
So for me, it's simpler to think about this just in the terms of culture. That's oversimplifying it, but it's okay. Here's me. Here's my culture, and I feel as if my culture is superior to other cultures. And what's crazy about this and makes it more than just this academic thing is that everybody does this.
Yeah.
Like even, I mean, you could go into cultures that are very, very different than ours, and they're judging other cultures. Tribal groups are judging other tribal groups, right? So it's everybody views their culture and their way of doing things as superior. There's something very natural about it.
Yeah, that's one of the things that, you know, I encourage everyone that I encounter, live some life overseas, get outside of your box, experience other things, because you will find this everywhere you go. It is a universal human condition. And yeah, it was the same thing for me where I was living. Like, I was shocked when people are like, oh, that person is from that province, you know, all of those people are thieves. And it's like, what? Or all of those people are, or everyone knows that, you know, just these broad stereotypes that would make Americans blush are just par for the course. Over then you're like, okay, this is a real thing. That's the stuff. So while this is, you know, it is about race and ethnicity and culture, all of that is in there. I can't speak today. We were talking before we recorded this. We have both been sick this last week. Our respiratory systems are crunchy. I think that's the best word we can use for it. We're going to power through this anyway. But while this is about race, ethnicity, culture, it's about a bigger thing. It's about an attitude. I would use a very, you know, when I walk through this with my students, I use a very broad definition for this, which is difficult in some places, but I think is a good starting point to introduce and to kind of dive into these waters a little bit. With this broader definition, I would say ethnocentrism is an attitude. Let's like start there. It's a perspective, it's an attitude, it's a way of thinking, but it's often an unrecognized one. That's one of the reasons why culture is so powerful, is because it's so unexamined. It's just a way of thinking that we don't think about. Like I often say that culture is like a pair of glasses. It's something we look through, not something we look at. Mm-hmm. And so ethnocentrism is an attitude, often unrecognized, of superiority and judgment over another who is different in culture, ethnicity, behavior, religious belief, or practice. So it's this way of thinking of like, my way is better than your way. However, that whatever way we're talking about, whatever thing that is. And that what's so difficult and dangerous, and especially in this topic of contextualization, so problematic, is that it's not something we even recognize as happening. It's so deeply built in.
Yeah. And I think that's why this is significant, especially like with undergraduate students, that they've never thought about this before, especially if they've not experienced much of the world. This is deep down inside, and they're saying things. I can get a conversation, so I can bait them into saying
Oh,
ethnocentric
sure.
things without them even realizing it, without them saying things that are ugly or even sinful, just their judgments on other cultures and the way they do things. And we all do it. So personal confession, where we lived in Peru, it was a tourist city. And
Mm.
so over 1 million tourists came through every year. And I suppose as an American living in Peru, I was always glad to see Americans, but I was really judgy when I spotted Europeans. And I could spot a
Huh.
European from a mile away. I could see him come, like, oh, there comes the Europeans. Like, why was I do? What was my problem with Europeans as a white guy living in Peru?
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, there I was in Peru judging these people just about because they dressed more professional than the Americans in
Sure.
their
Sure.
Alabama shirts and tennis shoes. But I digress.
No, it's the same. I mean, I heard the story in the opposite direction where an American guy, that he said he was on this road and there was a tour bus that had broken down by the side of the road, and he was with some Europeans, and they were talking about this tour bus, and all these people got off and they said, "Oh, look at those Americans." And the guy was like, kind of offended. It's like, "How do you know they're Americans?" They were 100, 200 feet away. And he said, "I know they're Americans because they all look like they're going to go fix something." And like that was his way to know that Americans were Americans, because of just apparently they look like they were going to fix things. But one of the reasons why we are bringing this up, especially under the topic of contextualization, is because, in the broader world of missions, in the missions world, the missions culture, especially from the American perspective that we are working from, this is kind of baked into the cake. Like, this is one of the just unavoidable ingredients of the missions endeavor. Because, I mean, if we really think about it, like, if you're going to cross a culture, if you're going to do the work of missions, if you're going to sell all your possessions and pack things into 50-pound suitcases and go to some other part of the world and live somewhere that you don't belong, you have to have a reason for it. You have to have
Yeah.
a motivation. You have to have a drive and desire and ambition. And oftentimes it's because I'm going to bring you something that you don't have. I'm going to take something good that is missing in your place and culture, and I'm going to help bring it to you and create it in your place. And that inherently is something superior, that I have something better that you don't. That's why I'm going here. That's why I've made these sacrifices. That's why I've done this thing. And so that superiority is just baked in. It's part of the thing. And so the way that comes out in ethnocentric ways is just kind of inherent to missions itself. And so it's kind of the elephant in the room a lot of times. It's
Yeah.
it's
You can see it in campaign groups when you see them on a plane. They all have their t-shirts on, their matching t-shirts, and that it's a younger crowd, and they really believe that they've got something good.
yeah,
They've got good news, and
right,
it's been drilled into them. If you really believe this is good news, how could you not share it with these people
right.
who don't have the good news? And so it's so innate in what we do, but at the same time, you can immediately sense we're better. Just the very fact
Right.
that we're on a plane with matching t-shirts, we're not going on vacation for spring break. We're going to share Jesus. Like, you already sense that they feel superior to everybody else. What's
Right.
it going to be like when they land the plane and all of a sudden they're in another culture? It's gonna be so, it's obvious to outsiders, but like you said, it's kind of baked in and we don't see it in ourselves.
I find that one of the ways to kind of test this in people is to, give them the scenario of what if a missionary came to your hometown? What if a South Korean woman who, watched Fast and Furious and saw the suffering of urban America and decided to come help Americans live a better life for the sake of Jesus? Like, how does that make you feel? There's a part of you that's like, hey, what do you do? What are you doing? What are you coming here for? Like, what do you do? What do you get involved in our thing?
Yeah,
Because it's like you wouldn't go unless you have something better, unless you are bringing something superior. And so for someone to do that in the reverse direction feels inherently chafing,
yeah.
because of
And
kind of
even
this
to
thing
flip the
baked in.
script, Like you mentioned urban settings. What if they read Hillbilly Elegy and then watched the Netflix movie of it and thought, oh,
Yeah,
those poor rural Americans? Because
right.
I'm in a more rural setting where outsiders are even less accepted. But in this rural setting, we're sending out campaign groups all the time,
Yeah,
sending missionaries out all the time. The evangelical church is strong here. But boy, in a rural setting like this, we do not appreciate outsiders coming in and telling us what to do.
yeah,
Just you city people, that's we struggle with that. So imagine if
right.
it's someone from Seoul, South Korea. Now you've got urban, not American, not Southern. Boy, we'd be highly resistant to that. But we can't. It's that's a great example. I never thought of that before.
Yeah, so much of missions, if you want to see it for what it really is, you just flip it around,
Yeah.
and then you kind of have to deal with this. And so this inherent superiority is just part of missions. It's part of the culture, it's part of the worldview. And so that superiority is going to translate into ethnocentrism in often very subtle, yet powerful and sometimes devastating ways. And so we've kind of got to talk about it. We've got to bring it up.
Yeah.
We've got to put it in because it is, in many ways, the antidote to contextualization. Contextualization can't happen when we have these ethnocentric stances that we're working from.
Right. But I want to defend people who haven't experienced other cultures and may have some ethnocentrism in them because they've not experienced anything else. We call that
Right.
monocultural, right?
Sure.
And there are a lot of our world is decreasing in its monoculturalness. I don't know if that's a word or not. It's made it
You
up.
can make it
So
so.
a monocultural person is someone who knows only one culture and language. My grandparents in the hills of West Virginia were monocultural.
Yeah.
They had not experienced other cultures. They had not experienced very many other ethnicities, kind of at a minimal level. And so that can being monocultural can lead to the assumption that everyone else is like us.
Right.
And then that causes us to judge others when all of a sudden people aren't like us. The difference between being monocultural, which there's nothing wrong with it. The vast majority of people throughout the history of the world have been monocultural. You could
Absolutely.
probably
Yeah.
make a case that Jesus was monocultural.
Right.
The difference, though, is ego, right?
Yeah.
When ego comes into play, that's when ethnocentrism is going to rise up.
Yeah, it's this idea that my way of doing things or my understanding of things is the right way. And so when I encounter someone who looks at it differently, has another way of doing things or another way of understanding it, then they're inherently wrong because it doesn't make sense to me, because it doesn't seem natural, because it doesn't seem right. And these are
Right.
often deeply unconscious things. It's not like we're going through and thinking about it. We just, in the friction of cross cultural experience, it's kind of like, well, one has to be right and one has to be wrong, or else I would do it your way. And clearly, because I don't, I'm doing it the right way.
And I guess I want to defend Christianity a bit. This doesn't just happen among Christians. If a group
Oh
of
gosh, no.
medical doctors
Yeah,
who were not associated with Christianity at all went on some sort of medical trip to a developing country, they're gonna there's probably going to be some ethnocentrism as they believe their way of doing medicine is superior.
yeah,
So this is not just a Christian thing. This goes across all fields, and probably, and we haven't like thought through this, is often associated with wealth.
hmm
The more money we have, the more likely we're
that's why
probably.
we succeeded, because we do things better.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yeah. And I've seen this a lot even in the social justice world, where we're dealing with trafficking or we're dealing with humanitarian aid, where it's the same kind of thing. It's like, I'm coming to help you fix the thing you couldn't fix on your own. And so the solution is to do things the way we do things, which kind of what we're nailing down here is the opposite of contextualization. Contextualization is not this pride-based closed mind, which is what ethnocentrism is, but instead a humble open mind to say, I'm going to look at your way of doing things. I'm going to look at your perspective, your worldview, your understanding, their framework of life, and say, where can I find the truth and the good in that?
And the core of this is the way you were just describing that made the golden rule come up in my mind. And back to our illustration, how would we want somebody, if an outsider came into our culture to share something with us, how would we want
Yeah.
them to behave? We would want them to be very humble. And so as I go into other cultures or interact with people from other cultures, wow, I've got to do everything I can to be a person of humility. Which again, all of this is we're saying be like Jesus.
Yeah.
Here's the solution to all of this.
Yeah. And that's the
Maybe we'll come back
incredible,
to that.
scandalizing work of who Jesus is and what he was the humility of a divine being, part of the Trinity, as superior as can be with fully justified superiority, coming in humble, coming in lowly, coming in meek and mild. That is just still scandalous today, to think of the upside down nature of the kingdom and the way that Jesus went about these things. Today's podcast is brought to you by Ozark Christian College. Many people want to make a lasting kingdom impact with their lives, but they're not sure where to start. At Ozark, the Master of Arts in Biblical Ministry will equip you for effective ministry rooted in Scripture. This degree is for people serving in a church, nonprofit, or a parachurch organization. With a fully online 30-hour option, the Master of Arts in Biblical Ministry prepares you to answer the kingdom assignment God has for you. Learn more and apply for free at occ.edu/masters.
How are things going? I mean, really going for your church post-COVID? At Kindred Exchange, we hope your congregation is thriving, that your people are connected to each other, your community is connected to your people, and all of these people are reaching the world with overflowing love and gospel impact. We have a hunch, though, because we are also a part of churches, that perhaps things are a bit messier than this. Over the last decade, we experienced new critiques to evangelism and American Christianity in a plurality of ways. Then, a global pandemic cultivated a natural break for many to step away from the faith community they had always known. We want to be a part of what's next for you. With the Mission Audit Weekend at Kindred Exchange, you'll gather with leaders from area churches to ask the tough questions about what's past, what's next, and what's best for the gospel to be an encouragement not only to your immediate neighbors, but to your neighbors across the globe. Through keynotes, facilitated workshops, and curated moments of networking and sharing, our team of mission experts will guide your church leadership through a 2-day assessment of your outreach programs and strategies. It's no secret that people are hungry for good news. Let's make sure we're using relevant approaches to help that good news be received as hope and light in a heavy, fast-changing world. If your church would like to be a city host, let us know. Or you can sign up for our next event taking place in Nashville on August 25th and 26th at www.kindredexchange.org/audits.
We've been spending the last couple of weeks looking at some case studies in Acts. We want to specifically bring up again Acts 10 and 15, where we see these realities that play in the early church. We've got Peter in Acts 10 dealing with Cornelius, this Gentile dude who, Peter gets this vision of this blanket with some non-kosher food where he's told to take and eat. And his response is, by no means. Like, what the heck are you talking about? I'm not touching this stuff. And that is an inherently ethnocentric perspective of like you and your food and your kind, and really the culture that's brought with it, the eating culture that's brought with it, is scandalous to me, forbidden to me, taboo to me, because my people and my way are the right way and not yours.
Right. So I'm not even going to go in your house.
Right.
And again, to give him some credit here, some of this is based on his theology, right? It's not just, oh, they're non-Jewish, I don't like them. This comes from a long, long history of not just tradition, but of what Scripture said and the way they interpreted Scripture. So this is deeply ingrained in him in the way that he interacts with people.
Yeah, dietary regulations are a big deal in the Old Testament. I mean, Book of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, they exist. And they gave very clear instructions about what you can and cannot eat. And so Peter's reaction in this moment is not simply, a dum-dum that needs to change. Like, it's not that easy. It's a guy who we would admire for believing in Scripture and wanting to do what God said and trying to be obedient to his regulations and laws that he's put on our life. But God has other things in mind, and he's requiring a change. We see it in Acts 15 as well, where we've got this multicultural church developing. The Gentiles are coming to faith. Lots of cool stuff is happening. But then these Pharisees come down and they say, hey, Unless you're circumcised, you can't be saved. Unless you follow the law, you can't be saved. It's still this ethnocentric attitude. Unless you do things our way, unless you do things the way that we have established and we believe in, then you can't be a part of this thing. Really, what I think these two things have in common, when we look at Peter and the dietary things, and we look at the Pharisees and the circumcision, is that in both situations they're saying the path to salvation, the way to Jesus, is that you become like me. And in the world of missions, all the kingdom work that we're about, and all the things that we're going to do, this ethnocentric thing of to be a part of this people, to be the people of God, you have to be like me, is a real issue we got to struggle with and we got to deal with.
Right. And you see it in Acts 10 and Acts 15 in dietary restrictions and then circumcision, right? So these two big issues. What might that look like today? So what are these things, if we're going to think that people must become like me and act like me, what's that going to look like? Like, what are some concrete examples of ways that we want other people to act like me, to act like us?
I mean, if we're going to put it in a cross-cultural environment, those are pretty easy. It would be like everything you consider church to be. So a cross-cultural church planning scenario. What is church? Let's start with the day of the week. Like, when is a church service going to happen? We are going to automatically go to Sunday morning because that's our tradition. That's what we're comfortable with. That's what we like. But does that make sense in this other place? To worship and how it happens and what styles and what songs and what language is spoken, and is a sermon going to be a thing? How is that going to be done? Who's going to do it and why? The entire understanding of church itself is going to default to what we know and what we experience in our way. So in a cross-cultural situation, that's an easy one to point at, is what is church and how does it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the obvious ways that we think through this, especially when it comes to like churches, like what is acceptable behavior when it comes to showing up at a certain time. And in our culture, with our students, they understand that, right? They understand if they're going to make good grades, eventually make money, they have to show up on time, and their behavior indicates or points to their value. And so we assume if we're in another culture and time is not as important of a value, I don't want to mix up behaviors and values here, but if it appears as if the behavior of showing up on time is not important to them, we think, well, perhaps they don't value worship, right?
Yeah.
We can get really judgy.
We said church starts at 10 a.m.
Right, just at the time thing. And even if we say 10 a.m. as Westerners, we say, okay, we said 10 a.m. We're going to give you some wiggle room here. And so we're going to even wait till 10:30, but good grief, it's 11:15 and you're just now showing up to worship God. You must not care.
Yeah.
And we've assigned their behavior specific values that is not at all what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of this larger discussion of, I think, when dealing with ethnocentrism, which is an inherent baked-in ingredient to the world of missions, that we have to separate this confusion of values and behavior. I mean, a shortcut, in my world, I have to define culture all the time. I feel like every time I talk to a new group, I'm going to talk about something cultural, and I have to define what culture is because it's such a big word. It's such a big thing. In our context, culture wars, and all that entails, like, it's a confusing word. And so the go-to, like, simplistic definition that I give is that culture is shared values leading to shared behaviors. Values are what we think matter. Values are what we think is important. And out of those values come behaviors, because if something matters and if something is good and if something is important and if something is helpful, then we will do things based off of that. So you gave the example of punctuality. Like, I think both of us, in the classes that we teach, if class starts at 9 a.m., for the most part, our students show up before 9 a.m. I rarely have a situation where I have to delay starting class before its designated time, because our students have created a culture. They value time because they know if they don't show up to class on time, they're going to get a lower score. There's going to be, grade consequences to that. which could ultimately result in them failing class or losing a scholarship or something financial involved. And so the desire to get a good grade, the desire to not have to pay for this class again or to lose a scholarship involved, that time and money values drive them to be punctual and drive them to show up on time. And so they create a culture where if class is supposed to start at 9 a.m., it starts at 9 a.m. because their values, the things that are important to them, the things that matter, have led to the behaviors that make sense. It's just, a very quick and dirty way of explaining how culture works. Unfortunately, it's so much more complicated than that because most of our values and behaviors are unrecognized, they're unexamined, they're unconscious. We just do them. Like, I say to students all the time, the first decision you make it every day is what to do with your alarm clock. That's the very first choice that most human beings make. It goes off. What are you going to do? You're going to make a choice. You're going to have a behavior that, whether you recognize it or not, is based on a value. So in that moment, what do you value more? Do you value getting up so that you can exercise, getting up so that you can, have some devotional time, getting up so that you can have a more relaxing morning before you go do what you got to do? Or do you value 9 more minutes of sleep? Like that value, which one is more important in the competition and competing of values, is going to lead to your choice and behavior. That's just how culture happens.
Yeah, the simplest definition of culture that I heard one time was it's the rules to the game of life, which goes back to the value thing, right? It's what we value. What are the rules in my culture? What are the values in my culture that determine how we behave? So it's the rules of the game of life that then determine how we live, because we're gonna follow the rules to the game of life in any given culture. And where this comes into play with contextualization is when our rules are different, when our values are different, we get really, really judgy. And this isn't just across like national borders, right? This is right here in our own culture as we think about different ethnicities and the way we're going to communicate with and share the good news of Jesus with people from other cultures right here among us, or from other ethnicities who are right here among us. And so you got the white church who is trying to reach out to the Latino population in their community, and they're going to have some trouble understanding why people can't show up on time. And the Latino population is going to look at the white church and say, oh, wait, why are they here for an hour and then they are gone, never to see each other again until 3 or 4 days or another week, which that doesn't make any sense to them. And so we both do it. We both judge each other on those values.
And it happens across generations. It happens urban versus rural. It happens educated, uneducated. It happens white collar, blue collar. Like every way that you can divide people, this conflict is going to exist. And we assume things. And I think where this becomes a real problem, especially under this, again, our topic for today of ethnocentrism, is when in this values leading to behavior, we kind of shortcut it and smash it together where the behavior becomes the value, where whatever high-minded concept was driving this choice that we made, that whole thing has been smashed together into one, as to where this choice, this behavior, is the only way to live this value. It's the only way to make this thing important. And so ethnocentrism kind of thrives in that environment where values and behavior become one. So the example that we have here in Acts 10, the only way to value cleanliness, which is something that God, had taught the Israelite people to do, the only way to value that is to avoid unkosher food in every way, shape, and form. Ultimately, don't eat with Gentiles. And so while the value was good and something that God esteems, the behavior saying this is the only way to live it and this is the only way to do it is where the problem existed. Same thing in Acts 15. Righteousness, which is a value of God that would continue out through our life today, they believed that obedience to the law was the only behavior that led to righteousness, instead of the deeper thing that this is changing with Christ in the way that he changes everything.
And while we can see that clearly today, this was really, really challenging for the early church, because this was a shift for them, not just a shift of tradition. This was a shift. This went against the direct teachings of Scripture. They had Scripture to back up their point.
Yeah.
So
strong biblical arguments.
Yeah. And so with this shift, you've got some real trouble. It requires a shift in heart, and it requires a ton of humility,
which is hard.
It is really hard.
And I think we forget that we are struggling with these same things today, that we are dealing with these same issues, probably not as drastic I can't imagine, Jesus shows up, completely changes the game, living that out within the first generation before you have scriptures to base off of, before you have, a canonized book to work from. Yeah, this stuff is real hairy. And I'm glad we have examples to walk through, to look through now, but we're still dealing with the same stuff. We're still dealing with the same issues. And I think at the heart of it is that same thing, is where the values and the behavior have become one, where we say, the only way to live this value, the only way to hold this value is to make this singular choice, to have this singular behavior. If you don't have the behavior, you don't have the value. That's where problems arise.
Absolutely. So what's the solution here?
I think we have to keep values and behavior separate at the end of the day. That's super hard. That's
hard.
No small thing to do. But every time we feel that tension, every time we run into a situation where people are, doing it wrong, we have to ask ourselves, what is the behavior and what is the value? Separate those two things. Because one of the difficult things in dealing with culture is recognizing that values, for the most part, are often neutral things. They're not right or wrong. They're just desires and drives that aren't bad enough aren't good or bad enough themselves. Where they become good or bad is how they're lived out. Where they become good or bad is in the choices. But the values themselves are kind of neutral things. And so, especially in the missions world, and we talk about, what we're trying to do kingdom wise, we have to know, what are the values of Christ? What are the universal, all places, all times, drives, motivations, ambitions, and desires of what it means to be a follower of Jesus? We have to know what those are, which is not as simple as it sounds.
Right. Which then leads us to say, okay, so situation arises, I'm uncomfortable with this behavior. We must reflect. We can't make snap decisions. We can't make snap judgments, and we can't verbalize. This goes back to self-control. I can't verbalize what I'm thinking in every moment. Good contextualization says, okay, I've observed this thing. I'm not real comfortable with it. Is this the value of Christ, or is this my culture trumping the values of Christ? And so what it takes reflection. It takes good Bible study and interpretation, where I go back and I try to say, okay, here's the value of Christ. Here's what scripture says about this. Is this something we still need to be thinking about today? And we're not always the most reflective of peoples, because we just like to be right. We're not good with dialogue and back and forth and trying to understand points of views. There's all kinds of reasons this is hard, not an excuse, but it takes reflection and humility and listening.
Yeah, superiority is one heck of a drug, and it's easy to get addicted. And that's what's going to go against us. But yeah, I think you're right. Hermeneutics is at the heart of this, biblical interpretation, because the Bible is sticky. Paul, when he's writing letters to churches, is teaching both values and behavior. He's not simply doing one or the other. He's not, getting nice, neat boxes to say, okay, here are the values of Christ that are important. And to you, Ephesians, here's some behaviors that need to follow. It's not for everybody everywhere, but just for you, Ephesians, consider this. Like, Paul's not dividing things neatly on this. These are all interwoven together. And 2,000 years later, we're hopefully making good choices on how we understand and divide these things, but it's not that simple. The values and behaviors are going to be different. And so when that conflict arises, when somebody does something that inherently makes us feel angry or upset, or this is wrong, we have to say, okay, what is the behavior? What is the specific thing that's happening here? And then ask, what is the value behind that? What's driving it? A good example that I heard recently in another thing I was doing, we did an interview with this church planner in West Africa. And he was talking about some of the challenges that he faces crossing cultures in West Africa and planning churches. And he said he was in this one village where they had this great taboo that on Tuesdays you couldn't farm on Tuesdays. You can do any farm work or anything on Tuesdays. And that was, I can't remember the exact reason, but it was creating a big problem in this church planning effort that they were making. And so you had this problem. You could come in as a Christian and say, that's dumb. You can farm on Tuesdays, get over it. There's no scriptural basis for this. We need to let it go. That would be an ethnocentric way of handling that problem. But this guy had great missiology. And he said, he went through this process. He said, okay, what is going on here? Here's the behavior. We've defined it. No farming on Tuesdays. He said, what is this about? What is driving it? What's the motivation behind these things? So he started investigating. He started asking people. He started getting stories behind it. And it turns out that the value behind this was caring for nature at the end of the day. that they felt like farming on Tuesdays, as it had grown through generation after generation, farming on Tuesdays had become the behavior in which to care for nature and not overwork the land.
Hmm.
And so he's like, okay, the value for this is caring for, in the Christian perspective, God's creation. We can get behind that. We can value that. We have scripture that says that this is a good thing that we need to do. So let's go back to the value. Let's talk about how we as a Christian people, you know what? We value the same thing. We think this is important too. Our holy book tells us that this matters, and have the conversation there. And he said that broke everything going forward. They says, because in a conversation, in a dialogue, from a humble position, we could say, hey, this is important to us too. Let's talk about some different ways that we can live this. Let's talk about some different behaviors that could come out of this value. And the dialogue was so much different after that.
Yeah, I mean, what you've just described is Hebert's critical contextualization process, right? For the most part. So people have been talking about this and trying to figure out how to do this for a long, long time. So we don't want anybody to think that, oh, it's 2023, we've just now figured this out. People have been talking about this and figuring this out for a long time. We've just struggled to implement it and listen to those voices that say, hey, there are ways to think about other people's culture and see the values behind their behaviors and not immediately jump all over them as if they're doing something wrong just because it's different than the way we do it.
It's almost like what we need to do is take the situation in all of its controversy and high blood pressure and everything that's going on with it, and let's keep walking backwards until we find the point of agreement. Let's keep walking backwards behind this hot topic to find the place where we actually have common ground. Let's work backwards until we can do that. And so I think we're talking cross-cultural environments, we're talking the world of missions, but if we took a domestic situation here in the States, if we took whatever, from the day we're recording this podcast to the day it comes out, I'm sure there's going to be a new hot topic that is the big controversy that every political pundit talking head is going on and on about. And ask yourselves, like, what is the behavior there? What is the actual thing that we're talking about? And then say, why would one group think this is important? And why would one group be against it and think it's actually hurting our society? Let's walk backwards, back from this behavior until we find the value underneath it. What is the value? Can we agree on that value? Do we both think this value is important? We just have opposite ways of thinking it's lived out. Where can we find the common ground? Where can we find the compromise? Where can we ultimately find Christ in this thing? It's possible that doesn't happen. I'm not going to say that's a universal thing that works for everything, but it's amazing how common that works if we're willing to walk through the process.
But that's good contextualization with any group of people, whether we're talking about a culture, whether we're talking about a religion, right? We're trying to find bridges where perhaps there's something similar. I literally just got out before I came to talk to you on Zoom, whatever we're doing right now, this podcast. I was teaching world religions, and today we did neo-pagan religions and Wicca, which, students are like, oh, they didn't know anything about it, and it's so much fun. Well, at the end of the day, what's the solution for connecting with somebody who maybe has been practicing neo-pagan religion? It's relationship and trying to understand where they're coming from. It's trying to understand why are they doing this? And then maybe even discovering, oh wait, they're not Satan worshipers. And so it's erasing the misunderstandings, perhaps understanding why they do it, and understand that they're kind people who are just seeing the world in a different way right now, and maybe we can help to point them back to Jesus. But it's all about understanding and relationships.
Yeah, and it's that question of why. It's that curiosity to understand what got to this point, because behind every decision was 10 different background stories and 10 different situations, and we got to be willing to walk that road with people to get where they are and to understand the why and to understand the motivation and to understand what's behind this. That takes a humble posture. It takes long-suffering patience to be able to do that, because you got to investigate and you got to be willing to hear stories. And it is funny, especially when we get to controversial hot topic issues, none of which we are mentioning right now.
Nope.
That sometimes when you do that investigation of why are we doing it, this way, what's behind this choice, you find sometimes that people are like, you know what, I don't remember. I don't know why we do it this way.
Yeah.
Like, you
Yeah.
find that motivation, that history has somewhere been cut off, been lost completely.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a terrible illustration, but and again, my dad described one of the places that he first started like doing some ministry and preaching, a little country church, middle of nowhere, before he had gone to school or anything. They had a white cloth that covered the Lord's Supper.
Mm.
On the table up front, there's a white cloth that covered the whole thing. And it was a big deal. And somebody suggested moving it, and everybody kind of lost their minds. But somebody started asking some questions. Why in the world do we do this? And it went back to, well, it was before we had central heating and air, and the windows were open, and we don't want flies on this. But it became such a strong tradition that any thought of removing it was problematic. So again, that's just a really simple illustration, even in our own culture, how we've got to ask questions and ask the why. And when we discover why, we sometimes discover that the original why has nothing to do with us now.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times people are willing to kind of release a little bit. They're willing to let go of that iron grip when we find out, oh yeah, this is completely irrelevant now because the situation that started it doesn't exist anymore. And so in that situation, we can have a long conversation about reverence for the Lord's Supper. Like, yeah, that's a real thing. I'm on board with that. We need to have reverence for sacraments and the way that a church body revolves around these things. It would be sacrilegious not to. But this white sheet isn't the only way. And it takes a long time to walk down that road. And it takes a lot of patience. But willing to investigate and willing to ask why is kind of our way to it. So I'm going to paint with broad strokes here, but I feel like kind of the advice I would give in this world of ethnocentrism, in this, controversy that we've looked at, Acts 10, Acts 15, the hornet's nest that contextualization stirs up. I give 3 pieces of advice. I talked about these last week. I'll talk about them again. Is number 1, we hold tightly to the values of Christ. To do that, we have to know what they are. If you don't know the values of Christ, that's on you, because you're not reading your Gospels. You're not sitting in the words of Jesus, looking at his stories and his teachings and his actions and saying, based on what I just read, based on Matthew 5, whatever it is, what seems to be most important to Jesus in what he teaches and what he says, and how he works and how he interacts with people around him. What seems to be most important to him? Figure out what those are. Make yourself a list. Go through Mark and see what are the top 5 values of Jesus based on all those things. You need to know what those are and hold tightly to those. In this, controversy and contextualization, what is cultural, what is universal? Like, there's where we find our universals. Mm-hmm. And then the choices that we make out of those values, we have to hold loosely. The behaviors that come from them, we've got to be willing to let go of. We've got to be willing to hold in this relaxed state to say, you know what, this behavior may work for us at this place in time, or it may have worked in the previous place in time, but I don't know that it's going to work going ahead in the future. I don't know that it's going to work right now. There may be other ways of doing this, and we're open to having that conversation, willing to do those things. And then ultimately, that our goal is not maintaining a way of thinking. Our goal is not doing it our way. Our goal is not being better. Our goal is following Jesus, and that hope and trust that that's going to be enough.
And there's freedom in what you've just described.
Yeah.
Because it not only does it allow us to contextualize more effectively, it frees us from the baggage that we sense in our own lives, and it frees us from our own traditions, and it frees others from our judgment. So I just hear the word in all of that, freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom to submission in Christ. It's amazing how submitting completely to Jesus ultimately brings freedom.
Yeah, I mean, that's the irony of Christian freedom, is it's not freedom to indulge. It's not freedom to do things my way. It's not freedom to do whatever I want. It's freedom to serve. It's freedom to love. It's freedom to have the fruits of the Holy Spirit born in you. That's what that freedom does. If the freedom's not producing that, then it's the wrong kind of freedom. Struggles with an ethnocentrism. Matt, what are some solutions? What are some ways that we deal with this inherent problematic superiority problem we face?
Yeah, we've hinted at it already, but we've got to be people of empathy. We've got to be willing to look at things from other people's perspectives and learn to appreciate their perspectives and their cultures and their ways. So I want to see things from other people's points of view, which means I've got to get to know people, develop relationships, and ask why.
Yeah, I was thinking as you're talking about this, I've had to learn to do this a little bit on a theological level. I'm gonna, if I can get a bit spicy here. Are we ready?
Yes, let's go.
I have had to learn in my theology to have a little mental folder, and that mental folder is called "That's Neat." That's the title on the folder. That's neat. And what I put in that folder are the things theologically that I just don't really know what to do with. Like a lot of stuff, things that happen in the Old Testament. I'm not going to name anything that happens in the Old Testament, but various theological positions or things that happen in Scripture that I'm uncomfortable with. I just put in the "That's neat" folder, and I'm like, you know what? That's neat. I'm not going to label that as good or bad. I'm not going to label this as like, something that we need to push up or destroy. I'm just going to put it in the "That's neat" folder, and that's the end of my judgment, is to say that's neat, and I'm going to move on because I just kind of have to. And I think if we take that approach to life, especially when we're in a cross-cultural environment and we see something happen, to not label it good or bad, but to say, hey, that's neat.
That's neat.
People show up 25 minutes late to my meeting. That's neat.
People eat things that I cannot imagine eating.
Yeah.
That's neat.
That's neat. Yeah. It's a label-free box in which we can put things to deal with later.
That's empathy. That's good. I think connected to that, and we've talked about the values and behaviors thing already, but we just want to be learners.
Yeah.
If we are ignorant, we're far more likely to fall into ethnocentrism and judgmental attitudes towards others. So the more I learn, the more empathetic I am, and that leads me to learn about others. It's going to allow me to see the world in a different way, that's the nature of travel. I wish everybody could see the world, because when you see the world and you experience people and develop relationships cross-culturally, boy, it just blows up our perspectives on ourselves. It changes everything. So yeah, we got to be learners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's just an approach to life. It's an approach to relationships. It's like if we have people in our lives that if our goal is to fix them, we're not going to be a very good friend. We're not going to be a very good spouse. We're not going to be a very good teacher. Like if we're looking at, like talked about Americans, we can recognize them because they look like they're going to fix something. We kind of got to recognize that we approach a lot of life that way. If I'm going to fix things and I'm going to fix you, instead of I'm going to just learn in a neutral space who you are and what you're about and what matters to you. I mean, this is, not a new thing that anybody's ever said before, but just avoiding the stereotypes of other cultures is a big one. Stereotypes are hard because they're rooted in truth. They always are. But they're just not helpful. The slower we can get to a point of judgment, the more we can hold things in neutral space. The more we can just be like, I don't know what this is, and I don't have to know, and that's okay.
And it may not be right or wrong. It may not even be connected to the values of Jesus. That here in the South, for somebody who comes from the Northeast, boy, they're viewed as rude or overly. Well, what if they're honest? It's not rude. It's not connected to the values of Jesus. It's just culture. Yeah. We're so quick to stereotype people, even in our own culture, people from certain regions.
Sure. What else? What are some other solutions to ethnocentrism we need to bring up?
I mean, really, this is all about contextualization. It's what this whole podcast is about. But people love their own cultures, right? And that's why they're ethnocentric as well. We all have a bit of this. Right. People love their own cultures. But as outsiders, if we're going to share this good news that we believe we want to share with them, then we've got to do so within the context of their cultures. And I think we have to learn to love that culture and their culture if we're going to be effective at this at all. And it's the only way we're going to contextualize well and overcome ethnocentrism is if we learn to love other cultures. And that's hard sometimes, especially if you're in the middle of culture shock.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a litmus test that every missionary needs to have is, do I love the people I'm with? Like, do I genuinely love this culture and this people who I'm working with? And at the same time, to give yourself grace for the moments that you just don't.
Yeah.
When you're having those days, when you're having those seasons, even if we're going to be honest. It may be time for a vacation. You need to,
Yeah.
go back to your employee handbook of furlough policies. When are you due for one? These kind of things to maintain our healthy space. But yeah, if we're not if we don't genuinely love these people and who they are, regardless of ways things get better, if we can love them where they are right here, right now, that's what Jesus did for us, and we have to be able to do the same things for them. Anything else to wrap this up?
Yeah, I mean, this is all about, we just need to be more like Jesus.
I mean, that's it. Yeah, I don't know why we have a podcast. We just
cancel the podcast.
Right.
Everybody should. We're good. Contextual. Be like Jesus.
Be like Jesus. No. The great contextualizer. Last thing I would say is just, we need to approach culture like Jesus did. Sometimes Jesus challenged culture. Like, he was a real big, you don't get, they'll joke, you don't get crucified on accident. You have to really be pushing the boundaries for people to react that way. And so Jesus absolutely challenged culture, but he also cooperated with it. He lived in it. He worked within it. He, pointed out the parts that were right and good and needed to be elevated. So there's a mix of challenging culture. There's a mix of cooperating with culture, but the ultimate goal was always redemption. The ultimate goal was always seeing God and his values lived out in this place.
Yeah, but it's crazy to me that, like, he would make both sides mad. As you think about, like, the culture war of the first century, the Romans and the Jews, and somehow, like, he at times cooperated, but other times he made both sides mad. At the end of the day, his priority was the kingdom. Like, it wasn't any particular culture. It was, we're gonna live out the kingdom in whatever culture we're in, and that's beautiful, and what we're ultimately called to today.
So, we can make that our own boundaries. If everyone likes you, you're doing it wrong. If everyone hates you, you're probably doing it wrong. You got to be somewhere there in the Christ-like middle. All right, Dr. Cook, it's been well, as always.
Yes, sir.
We are going to, in the next couple of episodes, tackle a bigger topic of contextualization, which is what happens when it goes wrong. I think in this topic, sometimes people have some fear and trepidation because they don't want to mess it up. This is, the gospel and truth and important things, and we don't want to cross a culture and screw these things up. And so the two big, dangers of contextualization are, on the one hand, syncretism, where we contextualize too far and we lose truth. And then on the other side, irrelevancy, where we don't contextualize enough and this thing doesn't make any sense. And so issue of irrelevancy, we'll tackle that first. Issue of syncretism, we'll tackle that second, of kind of where contextualization runs off the rails. That'll carry us through for the next 2 weeks.
And this has to, at least a couple, it's going to get spicy a little bit.
Sure.
It has to.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It'll be fun.
If we don't offend you over the next 2 episodes, then you need to find another podcast.
That's right. If we don't isolate you in some way and make you love us in some way.
It's been fun so far, but
failed.
All right.
All right. Good stuff.
We'll see you next time.